Hello everyone, this is Brent Lowe, Product Manager here at Tritium. Today I wanted to introduce you to a new feature in 4.8 called Client Certificate Authentication. In short, Client Certificate Authentication allows a user to log into Niagara without having to type in their password. This could be extremely handy. For example, if you wanted to create a kiosk application that allowed public users to have a dedicated view of a Niagara system via a pre-configured browser. Before we go too far, let's back up a little bit and talk about what Client Certificate Authentication is, and then we'll jump into how we can utilize the technology via Niagara. Client certificates are a way to identify a user or even a machine prior to granting access to some system. In this case, our system or server is Niagara, and for the purposes of discussion, we'll say a browser will be our client. Client certificate authentication depends on a mutual trust between our client and our server. This trust is established with a certificate. A certificate is created and both the client and the server are given a copy. The client, however, keeps the private key and the server has the public key. Upon the client connecting to the server, there's a negotiation that happens utilizing this shared certificate. At a high level, data that has been signed with the private key is sent from the client to the server, and that information along with the public key is used by the server to authenticate the client. Now that we have a little background, let's see it in action in Niagara. As a scenario, let's say that we want to provide a view of our energy usage on a screen in a public space. There's not a clean way to do this today as a username and password is required to get to the view within Niagara. Who is going to enter in this password each time it is required? This is where client certificate authentication comes into play. In this example, I will take an existing user whose default navigation leads him to the energy dashboard. Currently, the user is set up to log in via a regular username and password. The first thing I need to do is create a client certificate that I can share with both my client, a web browser, and Niagara. In this example, I'm just going to use Niagara to create a self-signed certificate. But it's important to note that you can use client certificates from other authorities as well. I will use Workbench's certificate management tool and create a new certificate. I'll fill in an alias, common name, organization, country code, and set my certificate to client. Note that you can benefit from some efficiencies if you make the common name the same name as the user. After creating a certificate, I want to export the certificate. I will export it twice. For the first export, I will only export the public certificate. I do not want to export the private key. I will name it with public to ensure that I know which certificate is which. For the second export, I will export the certificate with the private key. I will name it with private. Now I have both my public and private certificates. Recall from our earlier discussion that the private certificate will be used by the client, i.e. the browser, and the public certificate will be used by the server, Niagara. Let's set up Niagara first. To make client certificate authentication available, I first need to add the client cert auth scheme to my authentication services authentication schemes. To do this, I'll open the client cert auth palette and drag and drop the scheme in place. Then I'm going to go to the user service and update my user to use this new auth scheme. I will change my authentication scheme name to be client cert auth scheme. I then will need to add my public certificate. To do this, I'll need to exit and reopen my user, and then I can add the certificate. So now that Niagara is set up, let me try to log in via my browser. Aha! You'll see that Niagara recognizes that it's expecting a client certificate, but the browser is not yet sending it one. Why? Because we have not set up the browser to be the client. This setup procedure will differ for each browser. The gist is that I want to install my certificate including my private key in my browser's trust store. I'm going to use Chrome. In order to install my certificate, I'm going to go to Settings, Advanced, Privacy and Security, and select Manage Certificates. I want to import my certificate. As a side note, Chrome does not recognize .pem files. Once again, different browsers support different types of files. In this case, I needed to convert my .pem file to a .pfx file. For this, you'll need to use a tool such as OpenSSL to do the conversion. For the purposes of the demonstration, I've already done the conversion. I'll select my .pfx file, and it will ask me for my passphrase that I entered when I exported the private key, and then it adds my certificate. Now that my certificate is added, let me try to log into Niagara again. Going to the web page, you see that Chrome prompts me for the certificate to use and brings me to the login page. I want to click the box for Niagara to remember me so that I can make this a fully automated process. I can now log in and see my energy dashboard. Once I do this, there is zero user intervention when logging into Niagara. One important note is that the permissions that you give a user configured with client certificate authentication are very important. Whomever has the certificate and private key will be able to access Niagara and perform any function that the user has permission to perform. Please keep this in mind as you're setting up your systems.